Okay, you're started.
Nice.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's live session. I'm Rahima Wasti, Marketing Executive at Line Pro Dev, and I'm thrilled to have you all here as we dive into a topic that's both exciting and crucial in today's digital landscape: UI UX design for different platforms, that is iOS versus Android. Joining me today is our very own Philip Cutting, founder of Line Pro Dev, a visionary leader with deep insights into the tech world. Philip, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rahima. It's great to be here and to discuss this topic. I think it's going to be kind of fun. I always love comparing the battle and the design world between iOS and Android.
Same here. Philip, let's jump right in, and we're going to get into the foundation. When it comes to UI and UX design, iOS and Android are often compared, but they have very distinct guidelines and user expectations. Can you start by giving us an overview of the key differences between designing for iOS and Android?
Oh, sure. So the main difference lies in the design philosophies of both Apple and Google. iOS tends to follow a more uniform and consistent design approach based off of their human interface guidelines. And their focus is on simplicity and minimalism. On the other hand, Android offers a more flexible approach based off material design, allowing designers to be more creative, but also requires them to consider a wider range of devices, screens, and even approaches to design.
Yeah, well, that was a great overview, Phil. What from your experience, what are the major challenges designers face while working across both platforms?
Okay. So one of the biggest challenges is maintaining consistency while adhering to the specific guidelines of each platform. For example, navigation patterns like bottom navigation bar for iOS versus the hamburger menu on Android require a different approach, and designers need to balance these specific needs with the overall brand identity and also with the ability to have multiple design teams working on the same project. It's quite a bit of a balancing act.
Absolutely, that is correct. Consistency is definitely the key from marketing perspective. I'd say understanding the target audience on each platform is also crucial. iOS users tend to lean more towards the premium side, polished experiences, while Android users might prioritize functionality and customizability. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. This is where the UX designers and marketers need to collaborate closely. And understanding the user behavior and preferences on each platform can significantly influence the design decisions. And sometimes
Yes.
it's really hard for both parties. It's hard, right? Designers, marketers, they want to have consistent marketing across platforms. They want to have one screenshot, and for it to represent multiple, to represent everybody. But it doesn't really work like that, right? So for them, one of the things they can do is focus on the specifics that they're marketing and adhere to that. While developers and designers, they need to hone in and try to create, especially in the beginning, right, a seamless
Mhm.
experience that is pretty good on both sides. Right now, if this is when we're talking MVP and a mature product, right, for banking apps, for any larger business out there that's already existing with a customer base, the two departments are going to start to divide, and then the whole challenge is keeping them on the same vector and working together and communicating well.
That is absolutely right. And speaking of collaboration, how important is it for designers to stay updated with the latest trends and updates on both iOS and Android ecosystems?
It's so critical. It's so vital, dear. The tech world moves so fast nowadays, with both Apple
Yes.
and Google frequently updating their guidelines, introducing updates to material design, introducing new research to human interface design guidelines, and create and both platforms creating new technologies, right, and new ways for people to interact with the devices, and even as operating system versions change, they change the way that they like things to be presented. Right? It's gradual, but you have to keep up with it, and it's quite a challenge. And this is where designers need to be proactive in learning and adapting, in keeping up with the updated guidelines. And this is where networking especially comes into play, where they're continuously bouncing ideas off of each other. They're sharing challenges that they've had, and they're just building that community between each other, where they can share this knowledge quickly and help each other find things that aren't so obvious, right? Because if you're just reading the guidelines, you're going to miss a lot of nuance. But when somebody comes back and says, yeah, this app got declined, or these users had this feedback, now all of a sudden it becomes real, and you can understand the nuance that sometimes the guys that write the guidelines aren't particularly great at expressing.
Yeah, it's all about continuous learning, I believe, and continuous learning is something we need to advocate strongly at Line Product. We do advocate it strongly over here. And as someone who networks regularly, I find that engaging with other professionals can provide fresh perspectives and insights from every other person. Philip, what's your take on networking as a tool for skill development in UI UX design?
Okay. In my world, networking is invaluable, not just for learning, but also for career growth, and also for personal development. And it opens the doors to new opportunities, to collaborations, to projects and entrepreneurship. And I always encourage designers to attend industry events specific to their niche, right? And if they don't have one, I like them to try to develop one or two niche markets so they can grow inside that skill base, right? And it includes industry events, online forums, participating in discussions, teaching, right? All these are just great ways to stay ahead and to build a stronger professional network so that they have a leg up. And it goes one step further, that my business philosophy is that when I'm designing businesses, or when I'm developing the business model, I like to have that designer mindset. Right. I think it comes from a curiosity, a willingness to test things out and to experiment and to grow and to adapt to changing environments. So I think it's part of the whole thing is having that designer mindset for businesses and entrepreneurs, and also creating that network that you can share and collaborate.
Well, that is absolutely correct. Since you're such a pro at these things, let's talk about career navigation. With UI or UX being such a dynamic field, what advice would you give to budding designers looking to specialize in either iOS or Android design?
So my advice would be to first build a strong foundation in general UI UX principles, and then specialize. Each platform has its own unique challenges, so it's important to choose the one that aligns with your personal interests and style. And remember, versatility is an asset. And if you design for both platforms, you'll be in high demand. But also, there is so much power in the niche, in the specialization, that you're able to understand your users at a much deeper level. And this helps bring next level understanding and enhancements to the user experience. So it starts with being general and then focusing down into a niche.
Brilliant. That's such an excellent advice from your side, Philip. But from my side, that aspiring designers also should focus on building a strong portfolio that showcases their ability to handle different designs challenges. Your portfolio is often your first impressions, so make it count.
Well said. Well said. A well-rounded portfolio is going to be a powerful tool, and it's important to keep it updated as you gain more experience and take on new challenges and projects. In the very beginning, I recommend everybody to focus in on their niche while they're learning design, right? Don't just design everything that you can think of, but design something inside a field that you're interested in, and cover all the vertical in that field, such as social networking, as sharing, as solving certain problems, perhaps vision, or how to transfer from device to other mediums, right? Take that one skill and apply it across a spectrum, that one niche, and apply it across the spectrum, so that your few beginning projects have a lot more breadth and depth to them, so that people can not just say, okay, cool, say I love baseball, right? If I started a baseball app, a social network design project, and I cover the whole depth of that, from what fans are looking at to ticketing to the whole kind of spectrum, it's not a realistic project perhaps, but it shows everybody what I can do. And everybody can say, okay, yeah, I have a kids event platform. I understand that this guy's concept can apply to that, and he has all the skills well-rounded, right? This is where you begin. And as you grow, you're going to get to that professional portfolio and have fun with that.
Yeah, exactly. That is something that you've been preaching since so long, about building the portfolios and social networking. This is something you've been practicing and preaching since the very start. Before we move on to our final thoughts, Phil, what are your predictions for the future of UI or UX design on iOS and Android? Do you see any trends that designers should be paying attention to?
Oh, sure. So I see it as a growing emphasis on personalized experiences, where AI and machine learning play a significant role in adapting to the specific person's interest. And designers will need to focus on creating a more adaptive and context-aware interfaces that are taking a person on a journey, seeing how they respond, and continuing that journey within the mission of the business in the app. So also, we're going to notice a lot more wearable tech, a lot of IoT devices. And AR and VR are going to continue to evolve, and there's going to be new challenges and opportunities with user experience and user interfaces design that we haven't even really explored or considered yet.
Absolutely,
and these are pretty fun. The human guides, the human interface guides from Apple does explore some of that. And material design also, inside their documentation, talks about some of that, and it's becoming an exciting topic. And also for kids in college right now, I think there's room inside the doctorate and master's degree programs where you can start considering these questions and writing about it, and building very early on a professional portfolio and a professional presence that's going to carry you on. So this is a bit of a unique opportunity that hasn't really been so easily available, probably for a couple decades.
Yeah, you're absolutely about that. And now we'll move on to the questions that we are getting from the audience. We're open to those questions. What role does user research play in deciding between iOS and Android design strategies?
Oh, good question. It's if you can immediately tell that most of your audience is going to be one side or the other, right? Then that's going to guide your designs. A lot of the times we don't know that. So what we have to do is look at the general nature of the users and the avatar, and to see if they're looking for a more conservative or more holistic or aggressive design. And that might be minimalistic, that might be modern, right? That might be antiquity. Huh. It might be old-fashioned, right? So getting to know that information early on, and you can do this through the discussions, through surveys, through demographics. You can start even by posting on like X and see who your general target market is, who's responding, right? There's a lot of ways to see early on, kind of some hints about that, and design it for that, right? But still keep the general principles involved so that you don't alienate anybody.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Now let's move on to the next question that we are getting from them. What are the platform-specific guidelines for UI elements on iOS versus Android?
Okay, yeah. So you've heard me talking about the human interface guidelines. Those are iOS, right? So check those out. There's a lot of documentation online. It's a lot of fun, even for developers. This is a great read, and it's updated frequently. Now for Android, it's material design, and material design. There's versions one. One is outdated, but two, three. I'm drawing a blank if 4 is out yet, right? I think it's under research. And so material design is where we're at on the Android side. There are some considerations and nuances in between those. So it's good to read both of them and understand the differences. In Android, you're going to be looking at the challenges of having so many different screen densities and sizes. On iOS side, it's somewhat of a challenge, but nothing like on the Android side. So they have different focuses out of necessity.
Yeah, that is absolutely correct, and that was definitely some very solid advice from your side. How do iOS and Android handle typography fonts differently?
So typography is a interesting challenge on any platform, and I essentially delegate that out to the platform that I'm using. And generally, I think you should keep typography in a singular style, right? So I don't think you should have different typography for Android versus iOS. I think you should look at the emotional expectation that you're expecting from the typography choices that you make. Typography is an amazing science. I really enjoy digging into it. And I think you should, the guy that's asking this question, go read the guidelines in both the iOS side and the Android side, and you'll have some fun with it. If it's a topic that you are professional with, let me know. Maybe we'll do a quick little podcast together on it.
Great. And what are some of the latest trends in UI or UX design for mobile platforms?
So the trends that I see are still towards minimalism and modernism. And we're still looking at trends towards the dark theme, and we're looking at increasing the way that we introduce people to the application that we have, how we warm them up into a paywall, and how we create that tailored experience that makes it feel like the app is really for them. And those are the angles that I'm seeing recently.
Yes, that is one thing. And what are the performance considerations to keep in mind when designing for iOS versus Android?
Good question. I think it's more about who's your target audience than it is designing towards performance. I like to keep things in. So if it's a MVP, I still like to keep things very simple and get it out there as soon as possible and start testing and seeing how people are responding. And as you're testing, you're getting users on your apps, you're going to see what kind of hardware they have through your analytics. And then you can say, okay, what's my performance bottlenecks? How do I make considerations for people? Do I have to make considerations for people using older devices? Or do I have to plan for those ahead of time? This is all part of your initial market research, but it gets refined as you go. Now, some apps, for example, I've done some apps that are based off research for getting heart rates and for evaluating health of older people in their 70s, 80s, and so on. Right. And this was a very specific audience. They tended to have older devices because they don't like changing. And they were very kind of locked into their device and their expectations. Now, one thing we found was that we had this app that was able to do iOS and Android, but we found that often we had to provide a Android device, and it became like a calculator that you give the person, and they use it like a tool. In this case, where we're able to, for the studies, able to give them hardware ourselves, it became very simple because they didn't look at it like their phone anymore. They looked at it like a kiosk device or just like any kind of specialized medical tool that they were able to go and use. And this is interesting because sometimes you have to understand the challenge and how you're going to address these challenges. And sometimes it's the users that are a challenge, or not the like the people that own the phone, but
Exactly.
the caregivers, right? Psychologists are a funny example of they have expectations, and while they're super smart, they like everything to be inside their expected frames so that they can perform optimally. So you really be surprised on how your audience is going to respond to design choices. And that's why, if you're able to do that Figma design, get in front of them some and ask some of the users how they feel about it, if possible. Sometimes you can't do that, but I always recommend it when possible.
Yeah, that's great. And how do iOS and Android handle? Okay, fine. That is something that we're done with. Can you share your experiences with A/B testing design elements on iOS versus Android apps?
So for me, I use third-party tools to help with this, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just a matter of getting used to whatever tool set and framework you're going to use. And the big part is making sure that you do it appropriately. So one thing I found is that people kind of do too much extremes, right? They
Mm-hmm.
want to test something and they push it out to everybody, right? You should be a little bit more gradual on this and test 10% of the market, test 30% of the market, then
Absolutely
test
right.
60 or 80% of the market, but try with a small segment. Don't think just right off I should do 50 or 100% test to get the volume. You can get some really good data with just 5 users, right? So you'd be surprised how good data you can get with 5 users and 5 interviews and 5 surveys to help support your clause or to see if it's invalid in the first place.
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. Quite a useful advice from your side. And what are the most common design mistakes to avoid when creating apps for iOS and Androids?
Mm. I think some of the biggest mistakes I've seen is too much clutter and complexity. And then there's different designers of different experience have kind of like different challenges. More experienced designers tend to not to have less obvious problems, but they tend to make some assumptions that may not be exactly right. So the best
Yeah.
experienced designers I've seen, they go in, they do a lot of research to the industry, and they understand the general approach. Right now, they have to go out there and test that out with some users before they can really verify any of that. Right, so this is where they kind of make mistakes. Junior developer designers, they tend to try to be too creative. They want to reinvent the wheel. They want to go out there and make this amazing design that is going to be so fun and so amazing and memorable. But what turns out is that users get turned off because they have to think too much, right? And there's all kinds of challenges in between. But I think in general, some of the biggest design issues we see is too much clutter, is over adding complexity where it doesn't need to be, and missing the process, right? So the process
Okay.
often should be you take a cold user and you warm them up into what the app does. You introduce the features of the app. You give them a quick little journey, getting some information so that you can customize the app. Then you show them you have them register. You have a paywall. You let them know what's for free, what they have to pay for. You give them an idea of what they can access without doing anything, and you entice them into a paid version of the app. Maybe they don't take that paid version. That's cool. We still love on them and take them on the journey, but make sure that the experience is consistent throughout and that you're leading them along so they don't have to think. You teach them along this process. If you do that well, you're going to probably have a fairly successful app. Then you just need to split test your paywall, make sure you're asking the right questions, try more questions on the registration process, less questions, and see how people respond. After that, it goes into marketing, and then interacting with the marketing department and what they're learning, and seeing what you can do to help them be more successful in the marketing attempts.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. That it's going to be more about the service and the experiences that the user is going to have. And Edwin is asking, how do you approach designing for different screen sizes and resolutions on each platform?
Super good question. Material design has some really good discussions on this. So I'd encourage everybody to go check out the guideline in material design and see how they discuss it. I look at a few considerations. I like to have a tablet view, which is similar to what people would have on a small screen on a monitor. I like to have a large screen and a small screen design. And these three designs are pretty encompassing, right? And it's actually a lot, right? It's a lot to design and to try to integrate. Now, sometimes if the budget doesn't allow that, you have to decide what's your focus. And I would focus on, if your budget is absolute minimum, I would focus on having just a medium screen size that's going to look good on small phones as well as larger phones. That way you're keeping your message consistent. Now, normally these kind of budget constraints are when you're in the MVP process, which is okay because you're still just trying to verify if your app is going to connect with the audience and if you're able to solve the problem and get velocity in the first place, and see if you should really invest in the project or if you have to change your direction.
Beautiful answer to that. And now the question is, how do you ensure a consistent user experience across both platforms?
You know, this is a debate that we get often, and I don't have a formula for all cases, and I really wish I did, right? I wish there was some science on this. That's like, yeah, you should do this and disregard this perspective. But I think you have to look at your audience and see how they're going to use the app. For me, if it's an MVP, I want to go back and just create the most simplistic version that doesn't require a lot of design and developer differences to get it out there so that everybody on iOS can test it, everybody on Android can test it, maybe people on the computers can test it or tablets, right? I want to get it in as many hands as possible. And just by having this singular mindset, we're going to simplify the whole design into one essential process. And most people understand when you're beginning, when you're a new product out there, and they don't expect a totally polished app unless your particular market is expecting this highly polished, highly customized, very efficient, full solution in the beginning. If that's the case, you should do a lot more research in the beginning to make sure that you can compete in this market and that you can afford the development in the first place. And when you're thinking about the development, just don't think about development, right? But make sure you can afford proper discovery, proper preparation, proper development, and more importantly, make sure that you have the funds to market it or the ability to market it to that target market. Sometimes it's going to cost a lot of money. Sometimes it might be just a lot of time, or maybe you already have that audience and they're going to come to you no matter what. But they will have their preferences, right? You have to know your audience and how much they need what you're offering. The less they need it, right, the harder it is to design for them. The more they need it, the easier. Like I've said before, if somebody's hair is on fire, they'll take a brick.
Great. And what are the key difference in design philosophy between iOS and Android platforms? There's a lot of questions like that.
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's a lot of nuance, and the philosophy is different, right? So for Android, it's like they want to have that customizable feature. They like to have rich sets of options, and it should be accessible largely in the top menu, right? Now, iOS, they're looking for a more sleek, kind of refined, minimalistic approach, right? So simplify their process for them and make sure that your navigation is very organic and smooth. Now, these are, to me, some of the biggest considerations. Now, to refine it a little bit, take the devices and go into settings. Just go into the way that they like to organize menus and how to change options and settings. Look at how they toggle things. Look at how they group things. Pay particular attention to how iOS versus Android groups things. And this little experiment is really going to teach you a lot about what's the differences today, right, and into the future, at this time, in current time, what users expect. Every user, it's hard for any user or group to say, yeah, we hate the way that the operating system designed the navigation and settings. We don't think like that, right? Every operating system designer is going to take those core principles of design and expectations and put it into the way their operating system works. So do that experimentation and dig in for a few hours and see what the differences are. You might find yourself really surprised. And sometimes it's really just, and sometimes it can be very cosmetic and not functional, right? Sometimes it's just a matter of using a different design aesthetic, different kinds of icons, more sleek icons versus, more ornate or busy icons, right? Or weight, difference in the weights in the designs. It's just a matter of experimenting and playing with it to really get to understand the differences. And it's very nuanced. Some of it is, iOS, they expect a swipe. Android, they kind of expect to have that back arrow.
Exactly.
It's very organic when you start playing with it. But until you play with an Android phone, if you're an iOS user, it doesn't make sense, and vice versa. And it can take a little time to get used to it. And there's all kinds of blood lost in that discussion.
Yeah, we get that. And how do platform-specific guidelines like Apple's human interface guidelines and Google's material design influence the design process?
So they influence the way that they influence the resources that developers have when creating their interfaces. So it becomes almost intuitive in a lot of ways. So if you have a iOS design and you let your Android developers use the closest thing for those interfaces, a lot of the times it's going to be very smooth. But if you really need to have a mature product that's refined, you want to go in there and make sure that the particular audiences have their own expectations and experiences. And really, to do this well, I found that you generally have different designers for both iOS and Android because they tend to specialize into those fields. Now you can have generalist designers, and this tends to be more when you cross-platform apps, and they do this fairly well. And the expectation is that it's good enough a lot of times. I still consider you can get very far with a cross-platform app, but at some points, it's still, I think, the trend that a mature product goes to native development if the company is making any kind of money.
Yes, you're absolutely right about that. And another question on your way: how do platform-specific guidelines like okay, fine, we're done with this. I'm sorry. How does the Apple approval process for the Apple App Store and Google Play Store influence your design choices?
This is a big deal. So this comes with experience and staying up to date. And there is some challenge in this, whereas recently these expectations and requirements have been changing very rapidly, especially on the Android side. Android nowadays is really trying to assert its presence and represent and create an environment for its users that's represents its users in a more meaningful way. And maybe this comes as a effect that there's so many apps on the Google Play Store, and for a long time it was very wild. But nowadays they want you to make sure that you have a good experience, the users have a good experience, and that it's a smooth process, and that everything is very functional with little to no failure rates. And the challenge, you're going to run into some challenges where you maybe have to say, yeah, this app was only going to run on modern devices, maybe in the past 3 or 5 years, right? Versus historically, Android development could, go 10 years back, 15 years back at this point, right? So you could have developed for pretty far back, but that's getting harder to do nowadays. And there's ways to do it, and there's regression designs for planning and regressions. A similar question we had before is like, how do you plan for performance, right? You have very performant machines, and then you have machines where you can hardly do anything, and you can create different designs and functionality and degrade features based off the functionality of the phone. And this comes with a lot of experience. And the good thing is, that as long as you're responsive and you're reading the instructions well with Apple and Google, right, and you're communicating with them in the way they prefer, there's a lot of tolerance to doing things well. Very little tolerance if you're an individual developer, but more tolerance if you're a company. So I encourage you to incorporate or deal with agencies if you really need to get your apps pushed there.
Great. And there's one more question. How do you handle your user feedback differently for iOS and Android apps during the design and iteration process?
I'm not sure that I look at user feedback differently between demographics of devices. I think I look at the feedback based off of how good of a match the feedback is to the feature of the app. So I like to weigh the feed based off of how on track is it, how on target is it's really aligning with what we're looking to do, right? So if I had a radio app, right, where I was playing music and somebody didn't like the way that the graphics were presented, I don't think I'd weigh that as much as if somebody said this feature for radios is a critical component for the experience of a radio goer, right? I think I'd weigh that experience more than the vague feature, right? And I think this is obvious. So there's times to look at which market it is that's kind of applying to. Now, the general question on this one might be 90% of my income comes from iOS. So do I ignore Android? And the answer on that one might be mostly, right? So if that's the question, you need to look at how much effort is needed to have a return on investment. And if you have this metrics of high return on investment, easier cost, the ones that you do first, and that's the feedback you prioritize, that's probably a good way to start, unless the mission is more important than the revenue. You just have to do your KPIs.
Great. One last question coming to your way, that is, what role does user research play in deciding between iOS and Android design strategies?
I think that comes down to the demographics of your audience and the maturity of your product and the budget involved, right? So it all comes down to difficulty, to time, and to costs. And once you've done a little bit of research into your product knowledge, into your product base, you can say, hey, it seems like out of 100 users, only one is Android, right? And if you get that initial information, then you have to look if the cross-platform or web app version of the solution is going to be sufficient, or if you need to go into a native app experience. And sometimes you have to go into that native app experience based off of early research. When you design a product well, you can create that other native experience, say Android in this example, right, where everybody was iOS or largely iOS. If you find that you're wrong and that actually, your initial demographic wasn't accurate to the larger case, but is actually 30% was on Android, maybe at that point you can say, okay, cool, we've done our minimum viable product. Is it now worthwhile to go cross-platform? Or does it make sense to go ahead and add a native component? Or even should we change direction, right? In the very beginning, you need to know what your KPIs and what it takes to be successful, to be a successful app, and to see what it's going to take to get you to that solution, rather than be tied into, is it a Android design? Is it a iOS design? Is it a web design, right? Should be a tablets or kiosks, right, where you can control the device yourself. Sometimes you just got to get that minimum product out there before you can get to know the fact. And if you have a more mature product, hopefully you have built in the analytics, the Google Tag Management, or whatever it takes to see how people are responding, where their troubles are, and who's using the app in meaningful ways. And then you can look at that and see where you're getting the most complaints, where you're getting the best responses, and see what makes sense. And this is management decisions that are hard to do. initially, but it's
Absolutely.
good to bring the whole team together. And this is what's fun if you're doing an agile development shop. This is what's fun about going agile is you can bring the whole team together,
Yeah.
the marketing, the designers, the developers, right? So your seasoned engineers, and you can say, hey, this is what we're seeing. Let's do a little bit of round table. Let's have a pizza and see where we should go and make some priorities and see how everybody can help in their own way to make this a better experience. And when you do it like this, you'd be really impressed with how much your team can do in a short time. And I really like to focus on doing things in a very short time as possible. Do things quick because things can change faster than you can imagine. And you can be in or out of business before you know it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Right, this happens a lot, and you're quite big on that. I can tell. Well, there are exciting times waiting ahead for sure. As we wrap up, what's the one piece of advice you would like our audience to take away from today's discussion?
So, I if I had to just give one piece of advice, I would say let me give two pieces of advice. One for one for upcoming designers and one for entrepreneurs, right? For you upcoming designers, right? I want to see you create an amazing portfolio based off of a special niche and then have a fun portfolio where you show challenges. And I'd like to see that you understand both the iOS and Android side by reading those guides and being able to have conversations about it, but to pick one that you love and to focus on that, but not to totally abandon the whole other world, right? Just keep up to date on a little bit, read about it a little bit once in a while you're having a coffee. For my entrepreneurs, I want you to keep that design mindset, that curiosity, where you are going to look at the problem and be open to solutions and open to feedback and maybe doing things that don't make sense, right? Maybe you should simplify a design. Maybe you should take out images, or maybe you should put in images in some other place, or carry over categories and concepts into different parallels so that people can access the navigation in different ways, right? Maybe it's just, who knows what it is, but keep that open mindset, keep that your ears open and be ready to make decisions, but always try to say to yourself, how can I take this into a data-driven approach so that I can verify if these assumptions, this advice that I'm given, or these ideas that I have are resonating. And just keep that design curiosity going, and you'll grow your business way faster than you believe possible.
Great advice. I couldn't agree more to that. Before we go, a quick reminder to all of you to follow us on our social media channels and stay tuned for more such sessions. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to us. And thank you again for joining, have a great day ahead. Thank you so much, Philip, for being here, for being so patient and giving us such insightful sessions.
I had such a great time. Thank the audience for all the questions. They're really good ones, some really challenging ones in there. And take care, everybody. Keep designing with passion.
Take care of yourself. Goodbye.